I would like to welcome Dr. Roxanne Kellar. She's a professor at UNO. When I read about her, I learned so many great things. She has a deep experience within plant biology. She went and got her Ph.D. from the University of Texas back in 2009, and ever since then, she's been publishing several of her own works on her own research projects, and as well as doing many conferences. So she's super awesome. When I met with her, she has such great spirit and such great energy, and I'm so excited to learn from her. So thank you all for being here and supporting her research and her studies, as well as what we do at Conservation Nebraska. We appreciate every one of you being here to learn and to find out more solutions for the environment. So yeah, I also want to let you guys know you are totally on mute. We cannot see you, but throughout the presentation, feel free to post any questions into either the chat or the Q&A, and I will read them off as soon as Dr. Kellar is ready to
projects that people are doing to try to restore biodiversity in natural ecosystems. So I'm going to start right off with a quick little question, and you can see on the left and the right here we have two different communities with different tree species, and the one on the left has pretty much an even number or even distribution of the 4 different species that are shown in the diagram. And then on the right, we have community 2, which has mostly let's see, that's species A, tree, and then there are just a couple of the other ones. And so when you look at this, you might say, well, if we say that the number of species tells us how diverse a community is, you would say, oh, well, we have 4 species in community 1, we have 4 species in community 2. So if you didn't actually see this diagram, you would say, oh, they are equally diverse. But there are a lot of other factors that come into assessing biodiversity, and that can be the abundance of the different species, the proportions, the rarity, how if there is an imminent threat of destruction of a particular community. So there's a lot of information that goes into that. And so we're talking about why is diversity important. And I will first start with talking simply just about what is biodiversity, then some facts about the importance, some threats, and as I mentioned, talking about how biodiversity can be preserved. So what is biodiversity? This slide certainly shows a wide variety of amphibians, plants, mammals, insects, lots of different things, even a little botfly larva. If you've never seen a picture of a botfly larva, that's it. If you don't know what a botfly is, can talk about that later. Okay, so the technical definition of biodiversity certainly comes from the 2 words biological and diversity, and this definition mentions range of species, range of communities, and genetic variation. And so in research, we talk about this as being the 3 levels of biodiversity on which we must consider the diversity in a particular ecosystem. So as I mentioned in that previous slide, species diversity is simply what are the numbers of species. So if you happen to have watched Shark Week recently, they talked about how there's more than 1,000 different species of sharks. I think most of us are familiar with the really common ones, you know, the great white and the hammerhead and those things, but to think that there really are 1,000 different species is pretty interesting. The next level that we talk about biodiversity is genetic diversity, and that is their DNA, which is the blueprint in their nucleus, in their cells, that is different between individuals within a species. So just like humans are all the same species, but we have different genetic makeups, so do all other animals and all other life forms. And finally, the third level is the ecosystem or community level diversity. And so this is talking about not only the life, the organisms that live in a particular area, but what are the non-living parts of that community, the temperature, the chemicals, the soils. I know there's going to be a talk next week from a soil scientist, and we talk about all of these components in ecosystem diversity. So some examples might be the one that we live in, which is a temperate grassland ecosystem. We can talk about tropical ecosystems, deserts, things like that. So if we look at each one of these levels very briefly, the first one being species diversity, this diagram on your right might, let me see if I can get my little picture to go away. There we go. You might recall this sort of classification system that we use to identify and distinguish species. Each of these components many of these components make up a genus, many genera make up a family, many families make up an order, etc. And we give individual species different names, different classifications, depending on lots of different characteristics. And the way that a species is defined can actually be very complex. Some of you might recall sort of the basic definition of a species is, can it breed with another species? If it can't breed, then they are separate species. That is called the biological species concept, but there are other ways to think about how to define a species, like their physical characteristics, their morphology, and something we call evolutionary history, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. So if we define species, why is this important for biodiversity? Well, the identification, the naming, the classification, and the knowledge of their presence of species is important for being able to conserve them. In order to protect an area, an organization has to know what species are there and how many of them, etc. So species identification is important. How many species are there? Well, about 1.5 million have been described, and that includes all plants, animals, fungi, bacteria. That's estimated to be less than half of the number of species that actually exist. And of course, new species are discovered all the time. This diagram just shows across the bottom here, we have the number of species in millions, and then groups of different organisms on this axis here. And basically it's showing us, for example, with the algae, the green means undescribed species, the blue means described species. So scientists estimate that there are somewhere in the 400,000 species of algae, most of which have not yet been described. If we look at plants, somewhere around 350,000 species of plants. We estimate that there is, what would that be? Maybe 50,000 species of plants that haven't been described. You can see those that have the most amount of work to be done are bacteria, insects. Certainly insects goes off the chart because we just really have no idea how many insects are out there. So where is all of this diversity found? Well, the most species-rich environments, and again, by species-rich, I mean the number of species in a place, are tropical rainforests. That might have been the first thing you thought of, and it's certainly the one that most people think of because the land region occupies about 7% of Earth's total land area, and yet has the greatest diversity of any ecosystem. Tropical deciduous forests, this is those forests that have trees that drop their leaves in dry periods. Coral reefs are incredibly diverse, and also this one may not be as familiar to you, but large tropical lakes, particularly in Africa, have incredible amounts of diversity. This is a map of Africa. So just to give you a little information about this, you can look up more information about this, but there are a couple of lakes in Africa. One is called Lake Victoria. Geologists estimate the age of these lakes to be only about 150,000 years old, and yet there are hundreds of species of cichlids in those lakes, which is an incredible number of species to have evolved or distinguished themselves from each other in such a short time. So I mentioned measuring species diversity and species richness being the number of species in a community. So just a quick little diagram to illustrate that, because I'll have a comparison to this in a minute, is let's say we have this community, which we'll call community 1, and the white dots represent different species. Now this doesn't tell us how many of each species, etc. But in this case, we have 14 species, and in community 2, we have 10 species. So it's a simple metric for giving us information about the diversity in those communities. Does anybody have any questions before I move on? Nope? Okay, I'll go ahead and continue then. Okay. So species diversity was one level of biodiversity that we talk about. Genetic diversity is another. And so in every cell in our body and in the cells of every living organism, there is a set of molecules that hold the genetic information that is the blueprint for how our bodies function, how we move, how we grow and develop and reproduce, and all of those things. The different molecules in the DNA is made up of 4 different smaller molecules, which we call A, G, T, and C, adenine, guanine, thymine, cytosine. And what each human and each living organism has a list or a strand or a sequence or a length of these just these 4 different molecules. Humans have about 3 billion of them in our genome, and every human has a slightly different genetic sequence than any other human, and certainly the farther away we get from other organisms, the more different that genetic sequence is. So we talk about sequence variation, and that just basically means there are parts of our DNA genome that are different. Now, why is this important to biodiversity? We can look at, on the left here, we have a population of frogs, and we can see that there is variation, in this case, in their skin color. And there is some gene sequence in their DNA that codes for that color. And so the genes and the sequences that make up those different colors are what we call the gene pool. And the the bigger the gene pool is, with the greater diversity, the greater variation, the more likely that, and in this case it may or may not be relevant, but if the environment changes in the future and these organisms have lots of genetic diversity, some of them might be better suited to survive into the future than others. And so the bigger the gene pool, the better for diversity. Now, we also used these gene sequences. So I have down in this table, there are 7 different samples. So DNA sequences from 7 different organisms. What we do is we take a sequence of that DNA, a piece of that DNA, and we compare them among individuals to see which ones are more similar, which ones are more different, which ones are more closely related to each other. And we use that information to create a diagram like this called a phylogenetic tree. And you can think of it like a genealogy, where the things on the right here are like, you know, you and your sister and your cousin, and we go back in time and we have your parents and your grandparents and etc. on back. In the case of species, we have species on the tips of our phylogenetic tree. And as we go back in time, we don't know exactly what this ancestor was, but we know that it shared some characteristics with cucumber and some characteristics with soybean. So as we continue to go back in time, we get back to the original organisms prior to evolution. So we use that genetic information. You can see these horizontal lines are called branches. And this number on top tells me something about how different the genetic sequence for tomato is compared to tobacco. So this length of tobacco means that there are, just trust me that this is a measurement of how many of those A's, G's, C's, and T's have changed. So the longer the branch is, the more difference, the more genetic difference. So we can use that information to come up with another tool for assessing diversity in a particular community or ecosystem. So this is the same diagram that you saw before, but now we're going to take those 14 species in community 1 and we're going to make a phylogeny and see how long those branches are. And we're going to come up with a value called phylogenetic diversity that tells us the amount of evolutionary differences between species in a community. So let me give you an example. So this is community 1. The A, B, C, D, that represents the 14 different species that we said were in community 1. We have these lengths of branches that tell us how much genetic evolution has occurred. Now, if we compare that to, in this case, this species with only 10, this community with only 10 species, you can tell just by looking at it that this phylogeny on the right has long branches going left and right, meaning there's a lot of genetic differences between the species in that community. So we add up all of these branch numbers, and phylogenetic diversity actually has about 20 different ways to assess that information in that tree, but the easiest one to think about is just to add them all up. And because these, even though there are 14 species, these branches are all really short, this metric number is quite a bit smaller than this one over here. So the reason this is important is because, let's say a conservation planner is trying to determine where they want to put their funds into protecting communities, and they look at 2 different communities, and of course, hopefully there are more than 10 or 14 species in a community, but they have community 1 that only has, or that has 14 species, community 2 that has 10 species, and they say, oh, well, we want to put the money in the one that has the most species. This actually gives them a little bit more information to say, even though community 2 only has 10 species, there's a lot of genetic variation. There's a lot of genetic information in that community. So depending on the goals or the mission of a conservation team, they might want to choose that second one. So looking at diversity, biodiversity, there are a lot of components that go into how to figure out how much diversity is in a region. And finally, we have ecosystem diversity, which I defined before. And this is just a little bit of more information about how different ecosystems can have different temperatures, precipitation, the species that are present. You think about, say, the Mediterranean versus Eastern North America that has lots of forest. The species that naturally live there, the soils are going to be different, the nutrient resources, et cetera, are going to be different in those different ecosystems. Here's just another picture to give you an idea of what I mean by ecosystem diversity. So as I mentioned, we try to assess biodiversity for conservation, and there have been in the past ways that organizations like Conservation International and those have tried to figure out where to put their money. Back in 1988, Norman Myers coined this term hotspots. So you might have heard the term biodiversity hotspot, and he coined that term to talk about these tropical forest regions that are high in diversity. Conservation International continues to do this, and I think they have 34 or something like that now. The World Wildlife Fund has another set of characteristics that they use to define biodiversity. One that I thought you might find interesting is that the Nature Conservancies, the Nature Conservancy uses what they call an ecological conservation risk index. And basically what they do is they look at different ecosystems and they say, how many ecosystems, okay, given a particular ecosystem, how much of that has been protected and how much of that has been converted or destroyed, changed because of human interactions, etc. And the chart on the right here actually shows the world's 13 terrestrial biomes. They call these different ecosystems. And it turns out that temperate grasslands, which is where we, go back, which of course is where we live, has the highest conservation risk index, because even though for example, rainforests have had more, let's see, it's tropical, subtropical, there we go, rainforests have had more habitat converted. They actually also have more habitat that has been protected. So temperate grasslands have had lots of land converted for agricultural use, but very little of that habitat has actually been protected by organisms. So all right, so I'm moving on to my second topic. If I can just pause a moment, if anyone has questions about any of that.
We did have one that was just posted
Okay.
by an anonymous attendee. The question is, how does human-made genetic modification of crops influence the current evolution of crops, like DNA, resistance to pests, other attributes? And do you predict changing of crop attributes in the future that occur due to the continuation of human genetic modification and breeding of crop species? If so, what changes do you predict will occur?
That's a lot. I'm trying to make sure I heard what the questions were. Um, so we are making genetic modifications not only by what we might call, in the lab ways, but this sort of genetic modification has actually been happening for thousands of years as we have artificially crossed plants. We talk about the biological species concept in a previous slide where we talk about, if they can breed together, then they're not the same species. Well, that doesn't work for plants because there are a lot of plant species that we can actually cross and mix up their genetics. And, we haven't done any genetic modification in the lab, but we've done a lot of genetic modification with our crops. I think, and I'll talk about a little bit later about how I showed that phylogeny and talked about organisms that are closely related to each other. It will continue to be important for us to know what species are most closely related to our crops so that when we have a virus or a fungus or something attacking our crops, we'll be able to go to the closest related wild relative to that crop in order to either breed those through, pollen and, natural, I guess you could say natural means out in the wild, or to be able to do that, in a lab. Either way, I think if I might try to figure out what the deep question was, how will that affect biodiversity? It certainly will affect biodiversity. I can't predict how that will be positive or negative or harmful. I mean, certainly there will be species that are affected in a negative way, other species that will be affected in a positive way. If that person would like to narrow down to the exact question, if I'm not getting at it, I would be happy to try to answer again. There's just a lot in there, so I'm not real sure. I'd love to sit down and talk with you about it in general, but I'm not a a plant breeder. That's not my specialty, so I'm not sure if I actually know all the answers that you're looking for. But okay, did anything else pop up, Dakota?
Nope, not yet.
Okay, all right. So the next topic was the importance of biodiversity, and there are many practical benefits for humans. Here we go. So just talking about this, species related to agricultural crops can have important genetic qualities. For example, plant breeders bred a virus-resistant commercial rice by crossing it with a wild population. So this has happened with bananas. It's currently happening with cocoa. There are some people who fear that our chocolate is going to become very expensive, or we're not going to be able to get it because there are different fungal pathogens that are attacking our crops. And if we don't figure out how to grow that crop without that fungal pathogen, we're going to be in a lot of trouble. So the way we can do this, again, is if we know a close relative to our crop plants that have some sort of natural resistance to a virus or another pathogen, they can either crossbreed them or they can use some genetics to try, in the lab to try to help our crops grow. Another practical benefit I'm sure you all have talked about or have heard about something about the threat to our bees. We certainly have a lot of dependence on pollinators with our agricultural crops. So I don't know if you guys have had someone talk about bees in one of these webinars, but it's fascinating. So if you have an opportunity to, I can give you an example of somebody you can invite, Dakota. But one thing that I've learned is that bumblebees, native bees, bees in general are more healthy when they can feed on more than one species of flowering plant. So if they, are meant for a particular crop, they can do very well in the crop, but they also continue to collect pollen from, the weeds on the side of the, the orchard or whatever. So they depend on diversity to be healthy as well. Another practical benefit of biodiversity is that of the 150 prescription drugs that we use in the United States, at least 79% of those are based on natural sources. Of those, 74% come from plants, 18% from fungi, 5% from bacteria, 3% from vertebrate species. And so how this relates to biodiversity is the more biodiversity there is in the ecosystem, the more opportunities for us to potentially find other plants, animals, bacteria, fungi that have chemicals, molecules that we can use for cancer, Alzheimer's, lots of other ailments. One example is the rosy periwinkle, which contains alkaloids that inhibit cancer growth. And so a lot of our prescription drugs, or some of those chemicals that we use in our prescription drugs that can't be synthesized properly, so they actually still have to get them from the plants. Others can be synthesized. So it's, I actually teach a medicinal uses of plants class, which is a lot of fun. So again, relating to biodiversity, the more diverse the ecosystems are, the better chance we have of conducting bioprospecting and potentially finding additional sources. Another practical benefit of biodiversity is ecosystem services. And this is talking about the processes that natural systems undergo that actually help sustain human life. We can talk about purification of air and water, detoxification, cycling of nutrients, moderation of weather extremes, biodiverse rainforests do a better job of cleaning CO2 out of the air, taking CO2 out of the air. Healthy watersheds, of course, help keep the water clean, the air clean, and all of those different things. So ecosystem services depend on the natural ecosystems to be in their natural state of diversity so that they can function at the best way that they can. Other practical benefits for humans are the way we just use nature. We might like to go hunting or fishing or whatever we like to do out in nature. We might just want to sit by a lake and listen to the crickets and the frogs and things like that. But recreation is certainly important to humans, and having healthy ecosystems are much better to visit than unhealthy ones. We can also actually put some economic numbers on the value of biodiversity, such as products that are taken from nature that are used, or consumed locally. We can harvest products that are sold in markets. Oh, I guess that was all I had on the economic value. So there are other ways to think about economic value, but I think I cut them out because I wanted to make sure I didn't completely run out of time. Any other questions pop up, Dakota?
Not yet.
Okay. All right, threats to biodiversity. And this is primarily due to human activities and overpopulation. There are 7 major threats to biodiversity. The top 3 have to do with human activities that cause some sort of alteration to a natural ecosystem, destruction, fragmentation, degradation, and then climate change also threatens biodiversity, overexploitation of species for human use, invasive species, and the increased spread of disease. So I'll talk about these pretty quickly. Human alteration of habitat is certainly the greatest threat to biodiversity. I'm going to put a big long list here, and it's not to say that we won't do these things, or that we don't need to do these things. Agriculture, of course, we need outdoor recreation. We need livestock to graze if we're going to be meat eaters, and just our roads and getting around and all that. We're going to have all of that, and so those certainly threaten biodiversity, and we can think about how those are affecting biodiversity. One topic that a lot of people, as soon as you talk about habitat destruction, a lot of people immediately think of the rainforest, because they've sort of become synonymous with the loss of species. Again, because tropical rainforests occupy 7% of the Earth's land surface, but are estimated to contain more than 50% of Earth's species. So of course, you take out one small acre of rainforest and you have potentially lost, a species. It's just, it's synonymous, because just small destruction can cause big losses of species. And as I mentioned before, rainforests aren't the only habitats that have been altered by humans. Temperate grasslands, certainly in North America, is a big ecosystem that is important, certainly for our agriculture and for grazing. And it turns out that since the 1800s, as much as 97% of North American tallgrass prairie has been converted to farmland. I know there are a lot of places that are trying to restore prairies when they find more efficient ways to have crops and grazing and all of that. So perhaps that number will go down a little bit, who knows. Climate change, of course, and I like to take this opportunity to make sure everyone knows the difference between global warming and global climate change. Global warming is specifically the increase of Earth's temperature in both the oceans and the atmosphere. And global climate change includes global warming, but also talks about the change in weather conditions, such as the number of storms, the intensity of storms, the location of precipitation, changes in temperature. Even if we have the same amount of rainfall over the whole Earth coming down, it might be shifted to different parts of the planet that we haven't seen before. So again, big long list. This is going to be posted on YouTube, so if you want to read through this list, but these are some impacts of global climate change that have been documented by scientists, and include things such as the effects on crops and where crops can grow. As temperatures become warmer, as you move toward the poles, then the species that grow in a particular band, let's say latitude on Earth that has a particular temperature or precipitation, those are going to start moving more northward. So I won't read through that entire list. Another threat is overexploitation, which is simply taking more from nature than the natural world can recover. Cactuses are one example. If you didn't know, most cacti are endangered. The cactus family only grows in the New World, and they are threatened because people like to grow them in their yards and houses and things like that. So if you buy cactus, you might want to find out where they grew those. It's nothing new that humans hunt and harvest food and other resources from nature. When populations were small, this could be done in a sustainable way. And as populations have increased, there are some species that have gone extinct, some turtles, for example, and some areas of depleted some areas of large animals, leading to empty habitats. So again, overexploitation is a threat to biodiversity. Invasive species, I'm guessing you all are familiar with the concept. Species that establish and spread when introduced beyond their native range. The three I picture here are all invasive in Nebraska, just a few of the many invasive species that we have. And the way that they threaten biodiversity is because they utilize the resources needed by native species. Sometimes they will fill a niche in the forested area, like the garlic mustard, or in a prairie, they and, and they become aggressive, maybe because they're natural predators from wherever they came from, don't exist here, and they just sort of go wild. So they take up the resources that were needed for the natives. The natives aren't necessarily capable of fighting that type of aggression. And finally, the increased spread of disease. So as the globe warms, organisms like mosquitoes will be able to reach farther in the northern hemisphere. They will be able to come farther north and spread diseases like malaria and Zika that we heard about a few years ago, things like that. Any questions pop up, Dakota? Okay. So when I talk about biodiversity loss, so if there's a threat to biodiversity, biodiversity can be lost by the way that we categorize species. They can be threatened, meaning they're likely to become endangered. They can be endangered, meaning they're in danger of becoming extinct, or they can be extinct. Globally, 12% of birds and 21% of mammals are threatened with extinction. And of course, as soon as one organism in a location goes extinct, there could be a rippling effect or cascading effect that might cause other species in that ecosystem to become extinct. And the loss of species also means loss of unique genes and genetic diversity. So if you think back to this diagram that I showed early on, if we were to lose, say, the purple frogs, that genetic information would also be lost. And so the genetic pool would become smaller. The ability for that population or that community of organisms to survive in the future, if there are changes in the future, become less. It's always fun to just show some beautiful pictures. Unfortunately, these are endangered or threatened. And then the ones that maybe don't always make the posters, but still plants and insects and things like that are also threatened. So we've talked about species loss. This is talking about ecosystem loss. There actually are some ecosystems that have been threatened, and wetlands are certainly one of the are certainly faced with some of the greatest threats. They are often drained or they are filled and converted into other ecosystems like agricultural crops, things like that. The local, I already mentioned this about the extinction of one species can have an impact on others in the community. For example, this bat is an important pollinator, and if the pollinator goes extinct, then the plant has no organism that can transfer its pollen, and it could go extinct. Of course, once the species becomes extinct, unique genetic information is lost forever. So not wanting to end on such a negative note, there are lots of very positive what is the word I'm looking for? Lots of things going on that help to preserve, restore biodiversity. The International Union for Conservation of Nature has the red list that lists organisms that need to be protected. There are a lot of organisms on that list that haven't been studied to the point that we understand the threat to every species or even know what species are endangered. So there's lots of research to be done there. There are three big approaches that are used to establish new populations where species have either completely been lost or have reduced in size. They can restock a particular area if the numbers have gone down. I know they do this with birds and with turtles and things like that, where in areas that have reduced numbers, they try to increase those numbers. Reintroduction, like the wolves in Yellowstone back in 1995, wolves were completely eradicated from Yellowstone and they were reintroduced. And then introduction, this is a process where they try to find an equivalent habitat for an organism whose habitat is completely destroyed and no longer exists. That one certainly has a lot of research and complications that go with that. There are both in situ and ex situ conservation strategies. So in situ means that they are preserved in their natural habitat. So, you go to Africa and there's a wildlife refuge where the animals are living in their natural habitat and they try to protect them in that habitat. Ex situ can be, animals being preserved in zoos like tigers and pandas. It can be plants that are preserved in botanical gardens and that sort of thing. And the last one I wanted to mention is seed banks. Now, don't know how familiar you are with seed banks, so I'll just give you a little bit of information about that. This is where seeds are collected from the wild in a very structured manner so that they don't destroy the native populations. And they collect these seeds. The Millennium Seed Bank project, conducted by Kew Gardens in London, is probably the biggest seed bank project. Seeds of approximately 10% of the world's species are currently stored in seed banks. They are stored in cold, dry conditions. And I have this picture that sort of shows what that looks like once they collect those seeds. And down here in the bottom, they actually take a few of the seeds out every once in a while and make sure they're still viable. They'll germinate them to make sure the seeds are still viable. And other than that, they are stored in these cold, dry storage until sometime in the future when they might be needed. So to wrap up, if humans viewed themselves as part of nature, environmental protection would be recognized as a means of protecting ourselves and our future generations. So I like to always try to think of myself as part of nature, not above nature or outside of nature, although of course we are outside of nature if we're in our houses, but you understand what I'm saying. Okay, that's all I have. Any questions? I'll put my contact information up there too if anyone wants that.
I guess we're waiting for anyone to type out their questions. I have a few for you, and these are more like personal, questions about your research and your findings and
Okay.
your personal opinions. Like over the course of you studying biodiversity, has your opinion changed or dwarfed at all as you've understood, like, do you think that populations can come back quicker than we might assume?
So I'll answer the second part first, which is certainly when habitats have been disturbed, you can look at even Chernobyl in Ukraine and, if I can say it, lesser disasters where certainly plants and smaller organisms, they just find a way to re-inhabit some of these places. So it is quite impressive, the resilience sometimes of organisms. Now, of course, that doesn't, certainly not going to include all of the organisms. There are certainly some that are more fragile than others, but yeah, I mean, we can talk about threats to biodiversity, but there have been a lot of success stories of organisms and biodiversity being restored, sometimes naturally, sometimes with help. And then you also, when you first said, basically, I think you were saying, and it made me think if anything sort of surprised me with biodiversity. And I don't know if it surprised me or not, but I think it's interesting that when I look at diversity in a particular region or community or ecosystem that I actually include invasive species, because even though they're not native, they're still currently part of the diversity, and you have to take into account those. So that's kind of something that I hadn't really thought about until I started doing the research.
Yeah, that's interesting. Um, Someone asked, what advice would you give to someone seeking further education and a career in conservation biology?
Well, UNO has, I think, a really strong environmental studies program. I, we have, you know, a director of environmental studies that is very focused on not just having students come in and learn a bunch of stuff, but to be prepared to get a job when they finish their schooling. So he spends a lot of time making sure the students are taking the classes that are going to give them skills. You know, they talk to local employers, and they try to find out what skills do you want these people to have when they come out of college. So I don't know what age the person is. If you're in 5th grade, then I say, read. Well, I can say this to anybody: read. Read whatever you can. Follow Conservation Nebraska, follow World Wildlife Fund, the Nature Conservancy, and just continue to read and educate yourself about what is happening with those organizations, what kinds of research they're doing. And if something sparks your interest, spend a little more time thinking about it, because the funniest thing is that the term conservation biology is so huge and so broad that you can spend a lot of time looking at all the different avenues of conservation biology until you find something that really strikes your interest. So yeah, probably reading is the first thing I'm going to think of.
Yeah, and good point. I mean, whatever sparks your interest the most, that's what you're going to want to stick with, right? Keep learning, right?
Yeah, and volunteering too. I mean, volunteering is a great way to just meet people and learn things, because frankly, some of my mentors, I just sitting down and having conversations with some of my mentors and being out in the the forest doing some sort of volunteer activity and just talking to people, and you can learn a lot that way too.
Yeah. And it looks like Stephanie is saying kind of along the same lines that you just answered, but if you have anything else to say, she's wondering what advice you have someone that doesn't want it as a career, but more of a hobby.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a great place to start, is with these kinds of webinars. And again, I would say just joining any sort of local organization. If you're interested in plants, maybe there's a plant club, or a birding. Certainly there are birding groups everywhere. You can have a gardening group, or volunteer at the zoo or the Humane Society, or again, at a botanical gardens. Everybody loves volunteers. And you can really learn a lot. Fontenelle Forest, you can be a volunteer at Fontenelle Forest, that sort of thing. I would say just try to join groups and talk to people.
And Stephanie, I will say this next term with AmeriCorps, I'm really going to try and focus on our book club that we try and have. So we're trying to gather people at the beginning, and then we're each going to choose a book to read. So we're trying to create a little community and then study whatever topic you find interesting every month, as well as we do conservation conversations. We want to start that back up every month. So it's kind of like coffee shop or online Zoom, whichever is more safe at the time. And we just meet together and talk about whatever topic that you find interesting, or, is kind of hot at the moment. So once that gets started, I would truly push you to join those, because you just end up meeting so many incredible people who have similar interests as you. Yeah. Patrick Swanson has a few questions. He asked, where do you see in Nebraska and Iowa are the areas of greatest need of protection and in building corridors to link protected areas?
I think wetlands are probably uh, the ecosystem that needs the greatest protection, particularly because we have lots of migrating birds that come through this area. DeSoto National Wildlife Refuge, if you haven't been there, that's a great place to learn about our migrating birds and wetlands, which is just north of Omaha. And they are doing well. Each, again, as I mentioned before, each conservation group has a different mission. Theirs is particularly to try to grow the plants that have the seeds that the birds like to eat. So that's sort of their mission, their goal. But there are certainly areas of Nebraska that have had wetlands in the past, and a lot of people are trying to restore those wetlands, not only for the animals that might come through there, but to, again, provide the ecosystem services of, healthy water, clean soils, and all of those things. I'm trying to remember, what was the second question?
In greatest need of protection and in building corridors to link protected areas.
Yeah, I'm not sure about the corridors. That's a great question, and I don't really know the answer to that. I mean, yeah, not sure. Corridors are great things, and I know some stuff about them, but that's, yeah, I haven't really thought about locally what areas need that.
Hmm. Hmm. I didn't even know about that, so I should look into it.
Okay.
He's also wondering, what approaches do you advocate for enhancing protection of native landscapes to protect biodiversity?
What was the first part of that?
No, sorry, yeah. He said, what approaches do you advocate for enhancing protection of native landscapes to protect biodiversity?
Well, my favorite one is to grow native plants in my yard. That certainly, is something that potentially, if you have a yard, you could do. Even if you have some sort of covenants in your neighborhood that say you have to have a lawn, you can always have edges that have native plants that are great for pollinators, for the monarch butterflies and the bees and things like that. Can be incredibly helpful for pollinators. You'd be surprised how just a few plants in everybody's yard could really help. I'm trying to think of I'm trying to think of larger impact ones. I might have to have time to think about that one.
Yeah, there's another question, and you can answer it if you have any tips. I can answer it, whichever. What is the best way to find conservation volunteer opportunities in Nebraska? Do you have any big tips?
Why don't you go ahead and I will think about it while
Yeah, of course.
yeah,
Yeah.
go ahead.
So as I've come into this opportunity, I've found a lot of great groups that, like she said, have so many volunteer opportunities. For if you're speaking Omaha specifically, we have Keep Omaha Beautiful. They often do a lot of cleanups and different event types that are geared towards environmentalism and cleaning up specifically Omaha. Another great group is Noise, and they are
Yep.
focused in the North Omaha area. And they do a lot of incredible things, but I know every single Saturday they have a cleanup that they do, as well as many other things. And they have a big focus on environmental justice issues, so that's really awesome. As for, of course, Conservation Nebraska, we have so many webinars every single month. And this next term, I'm going to try and get more creative in different event styles that we can get people to volunteer at. I know we have a community garden that we always need help working in, and as well as Omaha Permaculture, they always need volunteers, and other big garden groups like the Big Garden, Big Muddy Urban Garden, that's kind of in Midtown area, and City Sprouts, they do a lot of free different event type things. So if you want just a list of those, feel free to email me. I put that into the chat. So yeah, I've come across so many. So if you want anything specifically, I can shoot one your way. Did you think of any, Dr. Kellar?
No, you covered, yeah, the ones I had thought of, yeah.
Awesome, cool, beautiful. Well, as of right now, that is all the questions that we have. Peggy said thank you, lots to think about. So that's always nice to hear. If there's anyone else, I'll just leave it open. Oh, Judith just said, thank you, Dr. Kellar, really informative. Thanks,
Glad you
Judith.
liked it.
Oh,
Thank you.
yeah, feedback is so great.
Yep.
Awesome. Well, do you have anything left to say, Dr. Kellar?
Nope. If anyone wants to chat more, feel free to email me. I can't, this is my office number and we're not going to be on campus much, but I'll be happy to respond by email. So if anybody wants to chat more, I'll be happy to talk to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for doing this, Dr. Kellar.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks
Your
again
knowledge
for
is so
inviting
good.
me.
Yeah, of course. Well, thanks everyone. Have a beautiful night. Be safe and enjoy the rest of summer.